You probably think you understand what silence sounds like. Most people do, but you don't. Not really. Real silence isn't an empty space or a quiet room. True silence is what happens when 300 people stop breathing all at once. It's the moment after they've just watched a monster shatter a child's world. Evan was on Flight 615 to Denver when Daniel Whitaker decided that sitting next to a teenager was beneath him. What followed wasn't a simple argument or a heated exchange. It was slaughter, and strangely enough, the worst damage didn't come from fists or shouting. The real brutality arrived later, delivered through a lawyer, a hidden camera, and the slow, deeply satisfying dismantling of a man's entire life. The boarding area at O'Hare International Airport was its usual disaster. Wheeled suitcases clattering over tile, the bitter smell of overpriced coffee hanging in the air, and travelers growing more impatient by the minute. It was a Tuesday morning in Chicago, gray and rainy, the kind of day that quietly pushes everyone closer to their breaking point. The guy at the center of this story is Evan. He's not remarkable, just a software sales rep who flies this same route twice a month. Airports are familiar territory to him. He recognizes the stale scent of recycled air. He knows the unspoken rules, like how standing too close to the gate agent guarantees you'll get bumped by overeager passengers scanning passes before their group is called. That morning, though, something felt off, and it was all because of one person. We'll call him Daniel. Evan didn't know his name yet, but he would soon enough, and so would everyone else. Daniel wore the kind of suit that probably cost more than Evan's car, a sharp charcoal three-piece tailored carefully to disguise the fact that his waistline was slowly winning the battle. Nathaniel. His hair was slicked straight back, his jaw looked permanently clenched, as if relaxing was beneath him. Even his voice sounded engineered to overpower a room. He stood near the Zone 1 sign, barking into his phone without a hint of embarrassment. "I don't care what the SEC filing says, Lucas," he snapped. "Tell them I'll be there at 4 to sign the merger. If the paperwork isn't ready, I'm firing the entire legal department. Do you hear me? The entire department." He ended the call without a goodbye and immediately redirected his glare toward the gate agent, a petite woman named Megan, who already looked like the day had beaten her down. "Hey!" Daniel shouted, snapping his fingers like she was a servant. "How much longer is this going to take? I paid for first-class priority. That means I board first." Megan swallowed and replied carefully, her voice trembling just a bit. "Sir, we're pre-boarding passengers who need extra time. Zone 1 will begin shortly." Daniel scoffed loudly enough for half the terminal to hear. "Unbelievable! I dropped $2,000 on a ticket and I'm stuck waiting behind Grandma. This airline is a joke." Standing just a few feet away from him was a boy, no older than 15. He was thin, dressed in an oversized hoodie with a faded vintage band logo, worn jeans, and scuffed sneakers. He was black, with a backpack hanging off one shoulder and large noise-canceling headphones resting around his neck. In his hand was a boarding pass, which he studied with quiet intensity. We'll call him Nate. Nate had the posture of someone trying to disappear. He chewed nervously at his lip, tapped his foot, and glanced around like he wasn't entirely sure he belonged there. He didn't look like a seasoned traveler. He looked like a kid flying alone for the first time, hoping he was standing in the right place and not about to mess something up. When Zone 1 was finally announced, Daniel lunged forward, shoving past an elderly man without hesitation. He slapped his boarding pass against the scanner and marched down the jet bridge like he was heading into battle. Evan boarded later with Zone 3. By then, the aisle was completely jammed. As he passed through first class, he spotted Daniel, already settled into his seat, sipping a pre-flight scotch. His laptop was open, his fingers pounding the keyboard aggressively, elbows spread wide into the aisle, so passengers had to twist around him to get by. Evan continued back to row 12, economy comfort. He took the aisle seat, his preference. He liked having an easy exit. The plane filled quickly. Overhead, bins slammed shut. People complained under their breath about legroom. It was the usual routine. Then Evan noticed Nate. The kid was slowly making his way down the aisle, staring at the row numbers with growing confusion. He stopped at row 4, first class. He looked at his ticket, then at the seat directly beside Daniel. Daniel glanced up from his laptop and sized the kid up, from scuffed sneakers to oversized hoodie. His mouth twisted into something ugly. This wasn't mild irritation, it was pure, concentrated disgust. "Excuse me," Nate said quietly. I think that's my seat." Daniel didn't budge. He didn't move his legs or close his laptop. He just stared at the boy. "You're joking," he said. "No, sir," Nate replied softly, holding up his boarding pass. Daniel let out a long, exaggerated sigh. "Stewardess!" he yelled, not pressing the call button, just shouting. A flight attendant hurried over, tall, calm, with patience permanently etched into her expression. "Yes, Mr. Whitaker?" So that was his name. "Check this kid's ticket," Daniel demanded. "There's clearly been a mistake. He belongs in the back, near the toilets, I assume." The cabin fell just a little quieter. That was the first warning sign. You don't say things like that in 2024 without people noticing. The flight attendant reached for Nate's ticket. The flight attendant smiled gently at the boy before turning back to Daniel. "No, Mr. Whitaker. The seat assignment is correct. That's his seat. If you could just move your legs and let him through, sir." Daniel's face twisted like he'd just been told to swallow something sour. "Who paid for this?" he muttered. "Affirmative action points." He didn't say it loudly. He didn't have to. Inside the tight metal tube of an airplane, even a whisper travels. Nate said nothing. He dropped his gaze to the floor, gripping the straps of his backpack so tightly his knuckles went white. He looked absolutely terrified. Daniel finally shifted his legs, barely, giving Nate just enough space to squeeze through. As the boy passed, his backpack brushed against Daniel's expensive suit jacket. "Watch it," Daniel snapped, brushing at his shoulder like he'd been contaminated. "God, this is going to be a miserable 4 hours." Evan watched the entire thing from row 12. He locked eyes with the man sitting beside him, a big guy named Henry who was holding a thick hardcover novel open on his lap. "That guy needs a drink thrown in his face," Henry muttered. "He needs worse than that," Evan replied. Neither of them had any idea just how ugly things were about to become. The doors closed. The safety video played. The plane pushed back, taxied, and lifted into the air. For the first hour, everything felt normal enough. Drinks were served. The Wi-Fi barely worked. Evan opened his tablet and tried to focus on work, though his attention kept drifting toward the front of the cabin. The curtain separating first class from economy wasn't fully closed, giving him a clear view of row 2. It was painful to watch. Daniel Whitaker had completely claimed the space. His tray table was down. His laptop was open. A drink sat on the center console. His elbows were flared outward like territorial markers. Nate, meanwhile, was crushed against the window, folded into himself, trying to occupy as little space as physically possible. He hadn't removed his headphones. He hadn't reclined his seat. He wasn't moving at all, just staring out at the clouds, as if disappearing were an option. Around 11:30 a.m., the turbulence began. It wasn't severe, just that uneven, rattling chop that makes coffee ripple and stomachs tighten. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, warning passengers about rough air and asking everyone to fasten their seat belts. Evan watched flight attendants rush to collect trash before buckling in. In row 2, Daniel kept typing, completely ignoring the seatbelt sign. Then the plane dropped. Not a gentle dip. A sudden, gut-wrenching plunge, the kind where your stomach lags behind your body as the aircraft falls what feels like 100 feet in a heartbeat. A sharp gasp rippled through the cabin. Nate's arm shot out instinctively. His hand slammed into the center console. More specifically, it hit Daniel as double scotch. The glass tipped, and amber liquid exploded into the air, splashing across Daniel's laptop keyboard and soaking into the lap of his tailored gray trousers. For a split second, everything seemed frozen. Then the liquid dripped between the keys. The dark stain bloomed across expensive Italian wool. Nate's eyes went wide. He yanked his headphones down, hands trembling. "Oh my God, sir, I'm so sorry," he rushed out. "It was the turbulence. I didn't mean to—" Daniel slowly closed his laptop. The screen made a sickening, wet crunch as it shut. He turned toward Nate, his face a color Evan had never seen on another human being, deep, blotchy purple. "You stupid—" Daniel hissed. His voice sounded like steam escaping a cracked pipe. "I'm sorry," Nate stammered, fumbling for a napkin from his pocket. "I can help dry it." "Don't touch me!" Daniel roared. The shout detonated inside the cabin. Heads snapped around from rows 1 through 15. "Look what you did!" Daniel screamed as he stood up, completely ignoring the seatbelt sign. The plane jolted again, but he stayed upright, fueled entirely by rage. "That laptop cost $4,000. These pants are Italian wool, and you ruined them because you're too stupid to sit still." "Sir, sit down!" the flight attendant yelled from her jump seat. She was strapped in and unable to reach them safely. "Shut up!" Daniel screamed back. He turned to Nate again. Nate pressed himself into the window, tears pooling in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitaker. I really am." "Sorry doesn't fix it," Daniel snapped, leaning in so close he invaded every inch of the boy's space. "You shouldn't even be here. I knew it the second I saw you. You don't belong. You're trash. Gutter trash, taking up my air." Henry unbuckled his seatbelt in row 12. "Hey," he called out. "Sit down and leave the kid alone." Daniel spun around. "Peasants in economy. Mind your business. This animal destroyed my property." He turned back to Nate. That was the moment when words weren't enough anymore. Nate, panicked, tried to squeeze past Daniel toward the aisle, maybe to reach the bathroom, maybe just to escape the spray of spit flying from Daniel's mouth. "I need to get out," Nate cried. "You're not going anywhere," Daniel said. He grabbed Nate by the front of his hoodie and yanked him backward, slamming him down so hard his head cracked against the plastic cabin wall. Thud. The sound was nauseating. "Sit down," Daniel snarled. Nate lifted a shaking hand to his head and stared at his fingers. There was blood, just a small smear, but unmistakable. "You're bleeding," Daniel laughed. It was sharp and unhinged. "Good. Maybe that'll teach you some respect." The turbulence eased. The plane smoothed out. But inside the cabin, the real storm was only beginning. The flight attendant unbuckled and sprinted up the aisle. "Hands off him. Now!" But Daniel was already beyond reason. He was the kind of man who had gone his entire life without ever hearing the word no and having it mean anything. To him, the world existed in a hierarchy, and everyone else ranked below. When he noticed the blood on the boy's face, something darker took over. The bully's adrenaline surged, and instead of backing away, he leaned in. Nate reacted on instinct. He lashed out in a weak, defensive kick. The sole of his sneaker scraped Daniel's shin. That was all it took. "You little filth!" Daniel snarled. He drew his arm back and drove a clenched fist into the side of the boy's face. This wasn't a dramatic movie punch. There was no exaggerated sound, no slow motion, just a heavy, wet crack, the unmistakable noise of cartilage collapsing. Nate's head snapped sideways. Bright, arterial red blood sprayed across the pristine white curve of the cabin wall, streaking the window shade and speckling Daniel's once immaculate white dress shirt. Nate didn't scream. He made a low, choking sound and crumpled sideways in his seat. His nose was destroyed. Blood poured down his chin, soaking into the faded band logo on his hoodie. Daniel stood over him, fist still clenched, breathing hard. His chest rose and fell as he stared down at the boy. Then he calmly wiped a fleck of blood from his own cheek. There was something disturbingly satisfied in his expression, like he believed he had corrected some flaw in the universe. And then came the silence. You'd expect screaming, panic, chaos. None of that happened. For 3 full seconds, the cabin went completely still. 180 people stopped moving. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. The only sounds were the steady hum of the engines and the quiet rhythmic drip of blood hitting leather. It was shock in its purest form. We were all processing the impossible. A grown man, a wealthy executive, had just beaten a child bloody on a commercial flight. Daniel straightened his cuffs and looked around. His gaze landed on the flight attendant, frozen 10 feet away, her hands covering her mouth. "He attacked me," Daniel said. His voice had changed. It was calm now, too calm. "You all saw it. That was self-defense." The lie hung in the air, thick and brazen. Then the silence broke. A seat belt clicked open in row 12. Henry stood. Evan had known Henry was big, but seeing him rise fully into the aisle made something click. This man wasn't just large, he was massive. He wore flannel and jeans, but the way he moved wasn't casual or sloppy. It was controlled, deliberate, heavy in the way trained men are heavy. Henry didn't say a word. He just started walking toward first class. "Sit down," Daniel barked, pointing a blood-smeared finger. "This doesn't concern you, fat boy." Henry kept coming, his face set like stone. Then others stood. 3 more men. Evan rose to his feet, too, without thinking. It wasn't planned. It was instinct. A predator had attacked the weakest member of the herd, and the herd was responding. Daniel saw Henry closing the distance and finally faltered. He stepped backward, slamming into the bulkhead. "Stay back. I'll sue you," he yelled. "I'll buy your family and evict them. Do you know who I am?" Henry reached row 2. Daniel swung, a wild, desperate haymaker aimed at Henry's jaw. Henry didn't flinch. He caught Daniel's fist in his open hand. The impact sounded like a baseball smacking into a glove. Henry squeezed. The sound of grinding knuckles carried through the cabin. Daniel shrieked. It was high-pitched and panicked, nothing like the booming rage from moments earlier. "My hand! My hand!" In one smooth motion, Henry twisted Daniel's arm behind his back and slammed him face first into the bulkhead. "Not another word," Henry said quietly. His voice was low, controlled, and terrifying. "If you make one more sound, I will put you to sleep." 2 other passengers rushed in, a man in a military T-shirt and a father from row 5. Within seconds, they had Daniel's legs pinned. The once powerful executive was forced face down onto the galley floor. The flight attendant returned with zip ties, securing Daniel's wrists and ankles until he was completely immobilized. Evan wasn't watching Daniel anymore. His focus was on Nate. Megan, the gate agent from earlier, was already there, kneeling beside the boy with a first aid kit torn open. "I need a doctor," she shouted. "Is there a doctor on board?" Gate Nate. "I'm a nurse," a woman from row 4 called out, pushing forward. They reclined Nate's seat. He was conscious barely, his eyes rolling back. His face was unrecognizable beneath the blood. It pooled in the hollow of his collarbone and soaked into the carpet below. "He's going into shock," the nurse said tightly. "Nose is definitely broken. Possible orbital fracture. We need to land now." The pilot's voice came over the intercom, no longer calm, no longer polished. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical emergency and a security incident. We are diverting immediately to Kansas City. We will be on the ground in approximately 20 minutes. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for rapid descent." From the floor, Daniel spat onto the carpet. "You can't divert. I have a meeting," he snarled. "You'll all pay for this." Henry knelt beside him, planting a knee firmly on Daniel's shoulder. He leaned close enough for only Daniel to hear. "Buddy," Henry said quietly, "you don't have a meeting anymore. You don't have a job anymore. And once we land, you probably don't have a future." Henry was wrong about one thing. It wasn't just that Daniel no longer had a future. The real problem was who Nate actually was. None of us knew it yet. Daniel certainly didn't. But as the plane banked sharply to the left and began its aggressive descent toward Kansas City, the reckoning waiting for Daniel Whitaker wasn't approaching anymore. It was already there, sitting on the tarmac, engines running, and it was merciless. The descent blurred together into a haze of whispered panic and the metallic scent of blood. The change in cabin pressure made ears pop, but not a single person complained. The plane no longer felt like public transportation. It felt like a secured crime scene. Nate lay stretched across all 3 seats in row 4, the passengers having cleared out without hesitation. The nurse pressed a compress firmly against his nose, which was swelling rapidly. The skin beneath his eyes darkened into deep, violent bruises right before our eyes. He was shivering, hard. A textbook sign of shock. "Stay with us, sweetheart," the nurse murmured, carefully brushing tiny shards of plastic from his hoodie. "We're almost on the ground." Daniel Whitaker was still face down on the galley floor, pinned by Henry and the man in the military T-shirt. He'd stopped screaming, not out of restraint, but because he'd finally realized no one was listening anymore. He panted into the industrial carpet, eyes darting wildly like a trapped animal. "You're all going to prison," he rasped. "Kidnapping, unlawful restraint. My lawyer will take your houses." Henry didn't bother looking at him. He simply shifted his weight, applying a little more pressure. "Shut up." When the wheels finally hit the runway, there was no applause. People usually clap after a rough landing. This time, not a single hand moved. The plane taxied fast, unnaturally fast, toward a distant, isolated section of the airfield. Through the window, Evan saw the lights, red and blue, everywhere. It wasn't just one emergency vehicle. It was an entire response unit, 3 police cruisers, a fire truck, an ambulance, and a black SUV with tinted windows idling nearby. As the engines powered down, the pilot came back on the intercom. His voice sounded worn and tight. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Authorities will board the aircraft immediately." The seatbelt sign chimed off. No one moved. The front door burst open. 2 officers in tactical gear entered first, weapons drawn but angled toward the floor. "Police, let me see your hands." "He's back here," Henry called out, slowly raising his empty hand. "He's restrained." The officers swarmed the galley, hauling Daniel to his feet. "Get your hands off me!" Daniel shouted, thrashing uselessly. "I'm the victim here. That boy assaulted me. I am Daniel Whitaker, CFO of Turnaround." An officer spun him and slammed him against the drink cart. The sharp, metallic snap of handcuffs echoed louder than anything else in the cabin. "You're making a huge mistake," Daniel spat. "Do you know who I'm meeting today? I'm meeting Samuel Brooks. I'm a VIP." That name, Samuel Brooks, hit the cabin like a pressure drop. Everyone knew it. He was the CEO of Royal Crown Logistics, a billionaire industrialist, one of the wealthiest men on the planet. A man known for 2 things: ruthless precision in business and near-paranoid privacy. Someone who could move markets or destroy them before breakfast. Evan glanced back toward row 4. The nurse was checking Nate's pulse. Then another officer boarded. This one wasn't uniformed. He wore a tailored suit, a badge clipped discreetly to his belt. Federal Air Marshal? FBI? Evan couldn't tell. The man walked straight past Daniel without so much as a glance and knelt beside Nate. He studied the boy's face. Then he reached for the backpack. He flipped it over and checked the luggage tag. The agent froze. He pulled out his radio, his hand shaking just slightly. "Dispatch, this is Agent Collins," he said. "We have a code red on Flight 615. I need immediate escort to St. Luke's Trauma Center. Clear all routes." He paused, listening. Then he spoke again. Quiet, but loud enough for the first 5 rows to hear. "No, you don't understand. The victim is Nathaniel Brooks." Daniel's head snapped up. The arrogance drained from his face in an instant, replaced by a pale, sickly confusion. "What did you say?" Daniel whispered. The agent stood and looked down at him, not with anger, but with something closer to disbelief. "Get this man off the plane," he ordered the officers. Then, for emphasis, he read Daniel his rights, twice. "He's going to need them." "Wait," Daniel stammered as he was dragged toward the door. "Brooks? As in Samuel Brooks?" The nurse looked up, her eyes blazing. She gently lifted Nate's limp wrist. Around it was a simple braided leather bracelet with a small silver plate. Engraved on it were 2 letters. N. Brooks. "He's a son," the nurse said quietly. "You just beat Samuel Brooks's son." Daniel's legs gave out completely. He didn't walk off the plane. He was dragged, his polished Italian shoes scraping uselessly against the floor as the full weight of realization crushed him. 3 hours later, Evan sat in a witness room at the Kansas City Airport Police Station. Statements had been taken from everyone seated in the first 10 rows. Henry, the hero, was in the room next door. The mood was heavy. By then, we'd all seen the footage. That was Daniel's fatal mistake. In 2024, nothing happens unseen. At least 10 passengers had recorded everything. The video of Daniel punching a defenseless teenager was already everywhere. X, TikTok, YouTube. 4.5 million views in under 2 hours. The hashtag #GesternFlight712 assault was trending #1 worldwide. But the real fallout? That was happening just down the hall. Interrogation Room B. Daniel Whitaker sat alone at a cold metal table. His tie was gone, removed and bagged as a suicide precaution. His suit jacket hung neatly over the back of a chair, unused. Sweat poured down his face despite the room being uncomfortably cool. He had demanded his phone call. He used it to call Lucas, his CEO. Evan would later hear about that conversation from a deputy who couldn't resist sharing the gossip. Daniel had been screaming. "Lucas, you have to fix this," he yelled into the phone. "This was a setup. The kid provoked me. Get legal down here right now." Lucas's response was ice cold. "Daniel, turn on the TV in the lobby if you can," he said. "You're fired. The board voted 10 minutes ago. We're invoking the morality clause in your contract. You get nothing. No severance, no stock options. And don't ever call this number again." Click. Now Daniel sat staring at the wall, hollow-eyed, when the door finally opened. He expected a public defender, maybe a detective. Instead, a man stepped in who changed the air in the room instantly. He was older, around 60, with neatly combed silver hair and a suit so expensive it likely cost more than Daniel's entire wardrobe combined. He carried a leather briefcase. He didn't sit. He just stood there, leaning slightly against the door, studying Daniel with a look sharp enough to strip paint. "Are you my lawyer?" Daniel asked, hope flickering weakly in his eyes. "No," the man replied. His voice was deep and steady. "I am Samuel Brooks's personal counsel, Thomas Redfield." Daniel swallowed hard. "Mr. Redfield, this is all a misunderstanding," he rushed out. "I didn't know who the boy was. If I had known—" "If you had known," Redfield interrupted calmly, "you would have treated him like a human being?" Daniel froze. "Is that truly your defense? That you only extend basic dignity to powerful people?" "I was under pressure," Daniel pleaded. "The merger, the meeting, I was flying to see your employer. I was coming to sign the deal." Redfield opened his briefcase. He removed a single sheet of paper and slid it across the table. "This is the merger agreement." Daniel lunged for it. Redfield snatched it back and tore it cleanly in half, then again. He dropped the shredded pieces onto the table like confetti. "There is no deal," Redfield said evenly. "Samuel Brooks does not conduct business with animals. Royal Crown has formally withdrawn its acquisition offer. Since the video went public an hour ago, your company's stock has dropped 40%. Daniel stared at the scraps of paper. "By tomorrow morning," Redfield continued, "your company will likely be insolvent." Daniel's voice broke. I can apologize. I'll cover the medical bills." Redfield laughed once. It was dry, empty. "Medical bills?" he repeated. "Nathaniel is currently in surgery for a deviated septum and a fractured orbital bone. But that is the least of your problems." He leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table. "You committed a violent felony aboard an aircraft under federal jurisdiction. The FBI will take custody of you in 20 minutes. The district attorney is preparing charges for aggravated assault on a minor, interference with a flight crew, and hate crime enhancements based on racial slurs witnessed by more than 30 passengers." "Hate crime?" Daniel squeaked. "I'm not racist. I was just—" "The video speaks for itself," Redfield said calmly. Then he paused. "But here's the part you weren't expecting." Redfield pulled out a tablet and tapped the screen. He turned it so Daniel could see. It was a photograph of Nate, but not the terrified boy from the plane. This Nate stood confidently in a tailored suit beside Samuel Brooks at a charity gala. Both were smiling. "Nathaniel isn't just Samuel Brooks's son," Redfield said quietly. "He's a prodigy." Daniel felt the room tilt. "He flew economy because he insisted on it," Redfield continued. "He wanted first-hand insight into customer experience and airline logistics. It was field research." "He was working?" Daniel whispered. "He was auditing," Redfield corrected, "and thanks to you, he identified a major flaw in passenger safety protocols." He closed the tablet. "You." Redfield snapped the briefcase shut. "I was sent here to deliver a message directly from Mr. Brooks. He wants you to know that he will spend every available dollar of his fortune to ensure you receive the maximum possible sentence." Daniel's breathing quickened. "He's already hired private investigators to comb through your past, your taxes, your previous employers, your divorce settlement." "My divorce?" Daniel croaked. "We found inconsistencies in your alimony payments," Redfield said casually, checking his watch. "We forwarded those findings to your ex-wife's legal team about 10 minutes ago. She seemed very motivated." Daniel collapsed forward, burying his face in his hands. "Why?" he sobbed. "Why are you doing this?" Redfield paused at the door. He looked back, his expression devoid of sympathy. "Because you beat a child bloody for spilling a drink," he said, "and you believed you could get away with it because he was black and you were sitting in first class. You thought the world worked a certain way." He knocked on the door to summon the guard. "Welcome to the real world, Mr. Whitaker. Enjoy the silence." The door slammed shut. Daniel was alone in the concrete room. The silence he had demanded on the plane, the silence he enforced through violence, now surrounded him completely. And it was deafening. But the story wasn't finished. The comma striking Daniel so far had only been legal. The social reckoning, the public unraveling, was just beginning. And it would come from a place no one expected. It all came back to the man in seat 12. Because while the plane was the crime scene, the internet became the executioner. By the time Evan finally checked into his hotel in Kansas City that night, the adrenaline had drained out of him, leaving behind a jittery, bone-deep exhaustion. He pulled his phone from his pocket, expecting a couple of missed messages from work, maybe a calendar reminder or two. Instead, his screen exploded with notifications. The video Henry had mentioned, the shaky vertical clip recorded by a teenager in row 4, wasn't just trending. It had gone nuclear. Every major outlet was running it on repeat. CNN, BBC, Fox, Al Jazeera. They were calling it the first-class beatdown. And even that coverage was slow compared to the ruthless efficiency of the Internet. In the 4 hours since the plane landed, online investigators had accomplished what would normally take law enforcement days, if not weeks. Daniel Whitaker's life had been stripped bare in real time. A Reddit thread dedicated solely to identifying him had exploded past 50,000 comments. Strangers dug up his college yearbook photo, where he was listed as treasurer of a fraternity later banned for violent hazing. Someone found grainy footage from 3 years earlier showing Daniel berating a valet in Miami for taking too long with his Porsche. Others unearthed his old tweets, posts filled with barely disguised contempt for service workers and the working class. Daniel Whitaker wasn't just the villain of Flight 615 anymore. He had become a symbol, an avatar for every entitled, sneering bully people had ever been forced to endure. His reputation hadn't simply been damaged, it had been reduced to ash. When Evan received his subpoena, it didn't surprise him. 3 months later, the trial began in federal court, and it became the most sought-after seat in the Midwest. Media trucks lined the streets 3 deep outside the courthouse. Satellite dishes tilted skyward like mechanical sunflowers, all competing for signal. When Evan stepped inside the courtroom, the air felt thick and oppressive. This wasn't just a trial. It felt like a spectacle. On the left side of the aisle sat Daniel. Evan barely recognized him. The man who had once filled the airplane cabin with noise and arrogance was gone. In his place sat a hollowed-out version of himself. Daniel had lost at least 30 pounds. His hair, once slicked back with obsessive care, had thinned and gone gray. His suit was clearly off the rack, ill-fitting, bunching awkwardly at the shoulders, a silent confirmation that his assets were still frozen. He never looked up at the gallery. He stared at his hands, which twitched uncontrollably. On the right side sat the Brooks family. Samuel Brooks occupied the front row. He wasn't scowling. He wasn't glaring. He simply sat there, solid, immovable, like a mountain that had no need to announce its presence. Beside him sat Nate. Seeing him made Evan's chest tighten all over again. Nate was mostly healed, but the violence of that day was etched permanently into his face. A jagged pink scar split through his left eyebrow where his head had struck the cabin wall. His nose, rebuilt by surgeons after being shattered, was subtly different now, carrying a permanent reminder of what had been done to him. Still, he sat upright and composed. He wasn't the frightened kid in the hoodie anymore. He was a survivor. Evan took the stand. He told the jury about the flight, the turbulence, the spilled drink, the sickening sound of the punch. He described the silence afterward, that unnatural vacuum where an entire plane froze in shared disbelief. The defense was clearly scrambling. Daniel's lawyer, a court-appointed public defender who looked like he hadn't slept in days, tried to sell a story of mental instability. "My client," the attorney stammered, sweat beading on his forehead under the prosecutor's stare, was experiencing extreme psychological distress, a claustrophobic panic attack brought on by severe turbulence. He was not in control of his actions. It was a flimsy argument, but in federal court, all it takes is one juror willing to believe it. Then the prosecution called its surprise witness. The heavy oak doors swung open. A woman entered the courtroom, sharply dressed in a navy blazer, her hair pulled back into a severe bun. She walked past Daniel without so much as glancing in his direction. A ripple of whispers moved through the room. It was Emily, Daniel's ex-wife. Daniel's head snapped up. For the first time since the trial began, something other than misery crossed his face. Fear. "Mrs. Whitaker," the prosecutor said, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "You were married to the defendant for 10 years. You've heard his claim that this incident was caused by a panic attack. In your experience, does Mr. Whitaker suffer from panic attacks?" Emily leaned into the microphone. Her voice was calm, controlled, razor-sharp. "Daniel doesn't have panic attacks," she said. "Daniel has temper tantrums." The courtroom collectively inhaled. "He's a man who believes the world owes him obedience," she continued, her eyes locking onto the jury. "In 2019, he broke my arm in our kitchen because I bought the wrong brand of sparkling water." Daniel shifted violently in his seat. "He paid the emergency room doctors to document it as a fall down the stairs," Emily went on, "and he told me that if I ever spoke up, he'd bury me in legal fees until I had nothing left." She turned slowly, first toward Samuel Brooks, then toward Nate. "I'm not afraid of him anymore," she said quietly, "because he isn't powerful." She faced the jury again. "He's just a small, angry man who hurts people to feel big." Daniel exploded. He slammed his fist onto the defense table, the crack echoing through the courtroom like a gunshot. "Liar!" he screamed, leaping to his feet, his face flushing that familiar, blotchy purple. "You ungrateful bitch! I paid for everything. You're nothing without me." "Order!" Judge Holloway thundered, slamming his gavel so hard Evan thought it might snap in half. "Mr. Whitaker, sit down, or you will be bound and gagged." But it didn't matter anymore. The damage had already been done. The jury had seen the mask fall. They hadn't witnessed a man overwhelmed by panic or fear. They had seen the same monster we'd all seen at 30,000 feet. Deliberations lasted less than 2 hours. For a federal case of this scale, that was almost unheard of. It meant there was no argument, no hesitation. When the jury returned, the outcome was already carved in stone. The foreman stood, a middle-aged man, stiff-backed, eyes deliberately avoiding the defense table. "In the matter of the United States versus Daniel Whitaker," he said evenly, "we find the defendant." The room went utterly still. "Guilty on all counts. Aggravated assault causing bodily injury to a minor, interference with flight crew members, guilty of the federal hate crime enhancement." Daniel didn't cry. He sagged back into his chair, mouth slightly open, staring at nothing. He looked genuinely confused, like he was waiting for someone to burst in laughing and announce it had all been an elaborate joke. No one did. Judge Holloway adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. He was known for being fair, even-handed. Today, his eyes were cold. "Mr. Whitaker," the judge said, "I have sat on this bench for 20 years. I have presided over cases involving drug traffickers, armed robbers, even murderers. Rarely have I witnessed such a grotesque display of unprovoked cruelty against a child." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You did not strike Nathaniel Brooks out of fear," he continued. "You struck him because you believed he was beneath you, because his presence offended you, because you assumed his ticket must be a mistake." Daniel's hands were shaking now. You could not accept a reality in which a boy like him belonged in the same space as a man like you. "Your Honor, please," Daniel croaked. "I can pay. I'll pay for the surgery." "This has nothing to do with money," the judge cut in sharply. "This is about public safety." He glanced down at the paperwork in front of him. "It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to 12 years in a federal correctional institution with no eligibility for parole for at least 10. The sentence hit the room like a physical force. Daniel gasped, a wet, broken sound. 12? He whispered. But it was just a fight. It was just one punch. Judge Holloway closed the folder with finality. "It was not a fight, Mr. Whitaker," he said, locking eyes with him. "It was a lesson. And now you're going to learn one of your own." 2 federal marshals stepped forward. They pulled Daniel's arms behind his back. The sharp click of handcuffs echoed louder than anything else in the courtroom as they escorted him toward the side door. Daniel glanced back one last time, searching desperately for a friendly face. A lawyer, a lifeline. All he saw was the back of Nathaniel Brooks's head, still, composed, unmoving, watching justice finally land. 2 years later, airports were still airports, rolling suitcases, stale coffee, the constant hum of anxious people trying to be somewhere else. Evan was back at O'Hare, Terminal 6. It was a Tuesday, just like that day. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the sky was the same bruised slate gray, rain streaking the glass and blurring the tarmac beyond. He passed Gate 8, the place where everything had begun. Normally, he avoided it. This time, his connection to Denver gave him no choice. A strange phantom feeling washed over him as he walked past the Zone 1 lane. For a split second, he could almost hear Daniel Whitaker's voice echoing, demanding priority, demanding space, demanding the world rearrange itself for his comfort. To shake the memory, Evan ducked into a urban news. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just something to distract himself. His eyes skimmed over glossy magazine covers. Politicians, celebrities, tech billionaires. Then he froze. Staring back at him from the cover of Forbes was a face he hadn't seen since the federal courthouse. Nate. But not the terrified kid in the oversized hoodie, pressed against a window seat. This was a man. The photo was black and white. Nate wore a tailored suit that fit him perfectly. He leaned casually against a desk, arms crossed, eyes calm and steady, confident in a way that was impossible to fake. The headline gleamed in gold lettering. The Silent Partner: How Nathaniel Brooks is Rewriting the Rules of Corporate Responsibility. Evan pulled the magazine from the rack, his hands trembling slightly. He paid, then found a seat by the window, his usual Zone 3 spot. He flipped to the feature. The article stunned him. It explained how Nate had refused to let Flight 615 define him as a victim. Instead, he had taken the massive civil settlement, millions of dollars Daniel had tried and failed to hide offshore, and liquidated every cent. No yacht, no mansion. Instead, Nate had launched Seat Flow, a nonprofit dedicated to legal protection, travel advocacy, and safety oversight for marginalized youth. And that was only the beginning. But the story went even further than that. Nate wasn't just lending his name to a cause, he was actively consulting with major airlines, pushing them to completely redesign their de-escalation training and passenger safety procedures. He had taken the worst moment of his life and turned it into armor for other people. His pain had become protection. Evan was halfway through a paragraph about Nate's lobbying work in Washington when a sharp, ugly sound snapped his attention away. Clatter. It came from near the recycling bins, maybe 20 feet off to the side. An older janitor, his shoulders permanently bent from years of physical labor, had been emptying an overstuffed trash bag full of coffee cups. He misjudged the weight. The bag swung wide and clipped the leg of a businessman, hurrying toward his gate. The businessman stopped instantly. Tall, camel hair coat, leather briefcase clutched like a status symbol. He looked down at his sleeve, where a single, barely visible drop of coffee had landed. "Watch where you're going," he snapped. The tone hit Evan like a punch to the gut. It was sharp, cutting, entitled. The exact same frequency Daniel Whitaker had used. The sound of a man who believed the world existed solely for his convenience. The janitor flinched, gripping the trash bag tighter. I'm sorry, sir. It slipped." "Sorry doesn't clean my coat," the businessman sneered, stepping closer and crowding the man's space. "Do you have any idea how much this cost? You people are always so careless. I should have your supervisor fire you right now." Evan's heart began to race. He pushed his chair back, already halfway to standing. Not again. Not this time. He wasn't going to stay silent, but before he could fully rise, a shadow crossed his peripheral vision. Someone else had already moved. A young man stepped forward, calm and deliberate, placing himself directly between the businessman and the janitor. There was no shove, no raised voice. He simply occupied the space, solid, immovable. "Sir," the young man said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight, enough to stop the businessman mid-rant. "He didn't walk into you," the young man continued evenly. "You were looking at your phone. You walked into him." The businessman blinked, startled. He looked up, ready to explode. "Excuse me?" he snapped. "This doesn't concern you." "It does," the young man replied. He didn't move, hands relaxed at his sides, completely steady. "You're yelling at a man for doing his job. It's unnecessary, and it ends now. Apologize." It wasn't a request, it was a directive. The businessman opened his mouth to argue, but then he really looked at him. He took in the tailored suit, the understated but expensive watch, and most of all, the eyes. There was no fear there, no hesitation, just a quiet gravity that suggested this wasn't someone to push. The bully deflated. "Fine," he muttered, tugging at his coat. He threw one last glare at the janitor, then hurried off, dissolving into the moving crowd. The young man turned immediately, the tension drained from his posture, replaced by something gentle. He reached out and steadied the heavy trash bag. "You okay?" he asked. The janitor let out a shaky breath. Yeah, I think so. Thanks." "People," the young man said softly. "I know," the janitor replied. "I know," the young man echoed. Evan walked over without even thinking about it. "Nate?" he said. The young man froze for a beat, then turned. Up close, the changes were unmistakable. He was stronger now, broader through the shoulders. The thin scar cutting through his left eyebrow was clearly visible, a permanent souvenir from Daniel's ring. Somehow, instead of marring him, it gave his face a look of resolve. Nate studied Evan carefully, his mind sorting through memories. Then recognition hit. "Row 12, Nate said, breaking into a warm, genuine smile. He extended his hand. "Aisle seat. Good for a quick escape." Evan laughed softly as he shook it. "You remember?" "I remember everyone who stood up," Nate said. "Henry? The nurse? You?" "I don't forget the good guys." He gestured to a couple of empty seats nearby. "You got a minute?" "Yeah," Evan said. "I do." They sat. It felt surreal. Sitting next to the man from the magazine cover Evan was still holding in his other hand. "I read the article," Evan said, lifting the Forbes issue slightly. "You've been busy." Nate laughed, short and self-aware. "Beats moping. I tried therapy, but it turns out suing bad people and changing laws is way more effective." Evan hesitated, then asked the question that had been sitting in his chest since the trial. "Do you ever think about him?" "Daniel." Nate looked out the window at the rain-slicked runway. His expression didn't darken, but it grew thoughtful. "I went to see him," Nate said quietly. "Last week, at the federal facility in Terre Haute." Evan stared at him. "Why? Why give him that?" Nate shook his head slowly. "It wasn't for him, Evan." "It wasn't for him," Nate said quietly. "It was for me." He needed to know whether Daniel still had any power over him. He needed to see the thing that had haunted him, up close, contained. And when he did, Nate realized something important. "He's not a monster," Nate said. "He's just nothing." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he spoke. "Daniel works in the commissary now. He looks 20 years older than he should. He sweeps floors for 12 cents an hour." When Nate walked up to the glass, Daniel didn't recognize him at first. And when he finally did, there was no explosion, no rage, no slurs, just exhaustion. "He asked me if I could help him get transferred to a lower security wing," Nate said. Evan swallowed. "Did you?" Nate shook his head. "No, I told him I couldn't help him, because the system treats everyone the same." He paused. "I told him he was finally experiencing real equality." Nate leaned back. "The hate ate him alive, Evan. He lost his wife, his money, his freedom, even his name. There was nothing left to fear." He exhaled slowly. When I walked out of that prison for the first time in 2 years, I didn't feel the punch anymore. Overhead, the intercom crackled. Flight 505 to London. First-class boarding is now beginning. Nate checked his watch and stood, adjusting his jacket, the buttons clicking softly into place. "That's me," he said with a small smile. "Headed to a summit on international travel safety." "Kanki, keep fighting the good fight," Evan said, standing with him. "Always," Nate replied. He started to walk away, then stopped. Reaching into the inner pocket of his jacket, he pulled out a small metallic card and pressed it into Evan's hand. "Here." Evan looked down. "A Global Services Upgrade Certificate." "Don't sit in Zone 3 today," Nate said, a flash of mischief in his eyes. "Legroom is a human right." Then he turned and headed for the gate. This time he didn't hesitate at the entrance to Zone 1. He didn't look down. He didn't shrink. The gate agent smiled and waved him through without a second thought. Nate walked down the jet bridge with his head held high, a man who had passed through fire and emerged forged, not broken. Evan glanced back at the voucher, then toward the window. The rain had slowed. A break in the clouds opened, and a single beam of sunlight spilled across the tarmac. He thought about Daniel Whitaker, alone in a concrete box, trapped in the silence he once demanded from the world. And then he thought about Nate, who had taken that same silence and transformed it into a voice powerful enough to change systems, policies, and lives. Karma isn't just about the villain getting what they deserve. It's about the rest of us refusing to look away. On Flight 615, the silence was broken, and looking Samuel Brooks at the man Nate had become, Evan knew it would never return. He picked up his bag and walked toward the desk. It was time for an upgrade. And that is the story of Flight 655, a brutal but necessary reminder that character isn't measured by the price of your suit or the section of the plane you sit in. It's revealed in how you treat the people you believe can't fight back. Daniel Whitaker thought his status made him untouchable. He forgot that, in an age of cameras and courage, no one is above the truth. He lost everything, his wealth, his freedom, his legacy, because he couldn't control his ego for a 4-hour flight. Meanwhile, Nate proved something far more powerful. The greatest revenge isn't violence, it's resilience, it's success, and it's turning your pain into protection for others. So what would you have done if you were sitting in row 12 that day? Would you have stayed silent to stay safe? Or would you have stood up? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. If you believe in justice being served, hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story about real-life karma. Thanks for watching. And fly safe.